A couple of things. First up, what a joy to be invited back. And of course, last year I was meant to come, but my sister very suddenly got sick and then died. But I'll talk about that on Wednesday night. And then Monsignor contacted me shortly after with your good wishes, and he was immediately issued the invitation to return this year. So it's a great joy and a great honour to be with you. We used to sell indulgences, and now we sell books. So, but if you buy this book tonight, you will go to heaven. So, I'm only joking. I can't say that's true. But this is the new book, and it came out last year, and I would have been talking to it last year if I'd been able to come. But it's available now, and so it's What Does It All Mean? A Guide to Being More Faithful, Hopeful and Loving. And it deals with issues of belief and unbelief, about prayer, and about being with God in the tough times. So big themes that I've explored over the years. And some of what I want to talk about tonight and tomorrow night especially is in this book. The other thing, I just wanted to give you a précis of where we're going. I want to take really seriously this year a challenge that Pope Francis has given the entire church. There's a bishop's synod coming in October, and he wants us to think very seriously about young people and their faith, and how we can encourage them and witness to faith, hope and love in the best way possible. And so he's challenged the entire church, particularly through missions and meetings and the bishops and parishes, to do all the reflection we possibly can so that we get clear on what the issues are and what we can do about it to make our church a welcoming and wonderful place for young people to discover their faith in Jesus Christ. So tonight I want to talk about that directly. Tomorrow I want to talk about the context, particularly the media context, in what are we up against and what are we going out to when we're on mission to the world. And then finally, what are we offering that? Well, it's not just good news for this world, it's good news for the next world as well. So I've called that last talk Glimpsing Eternity, that it's all about our mission right now, but also our mission to go out into the world. So that's where we're going to go. I'm not one of these presenters or mission leaders who now says, does that sound okay with you? Isn't it wonderful when we go off to conferences and they tell you what they're going to do, and then to get some validation they say, does that sound okay with you? And we all yell back, yes, that sounds good. And I've always wondered if collectively we all yelled back, no, I hate that. Well, I don't give you that opportunity. That's what we're doing. And I promise in my normal style it'll be as engaging as I can possibly make it. But, you know, I've been in the United States for a few weeks now, and I spent a bit of time in Florida. And I've been to Florida before, working in parishes and conferences. And of course, as you know, the car, NASCAR and the Daytona Beach Raceway, they're all, they're very big there. And I'd have to say that for over 2 weeks, people kept saying to me, do you know, Father, you look like Jeff Gordon. Now, I didn't have a clue who Jeff Gordon was. I'd never heard of Jeff Gordon before in my life. But this was repeated again and again and again, so much so that I went and found Jeff Gordon. Just call me Father Jeff Gordon. Now, apparently he's a king of NASCAR. He's been a great champion and a driver and extremely wealthy. So I'm wanting to convert Jeff to Catholicism so he can look after me for the rest of my life. But actually, you know, sometimes when people say, oh, you really look like somebody, and then you go and look at them and you think, oh, that's not true. I'd actually have to say I can see that. I can actually see that. And that's not just because he's handsome. That's not just. I hope he's a really nice guy too. What I want to talk to you tonight about is, in fact, picking up the present Holy Father, whose anniversary of election is tomorrow, but more on that tomorrow night. Pope Francis was elected 5 years ago tomorrow. And he's called the entire church to reflect on young adults, their faith and vocational discernment, culminating in this big synod of bishops. Now, synods are really strange things, really, because they're going to get together and talk about young people. There are going to be 268 bishops. 213 bishops are going to vote. They'll have 80 young adults, and I think the United States is sending 3 delegates, and 25 experts. And they're all going to get together and talk about young people. The average age of the last synod was 67.2. You've got to love the Catholic Church. So, now it is a bishop synod, to be fair. It's not a young people synod. Maybe the Pope should call one of those. But it is, in fact, for the bishops to reflect on how they can give even greater leadership to the church so that we can have as many young people part of our life, not just now, but in the future, of course, as adults. But things are already a little bit different, I'd have to say. Pope Francis has invited all young people to participate in sharing their input through social media and during the pre-synod gathering by hashtag Tell It to Francis. And so far, they've received 32,000 pieces of feedback. That's extraordinary when you think about it, isn't it? So already the Vatican is trying to say, well, this is how young people talk to each other. And the communications department there at the Vatican have already had an extraordinary success. And we're going to be able to follow those old men talking about young people live on a live feed, which will be over the website as well. So what the Pope hopes, of course, is that the Church also wishes to listen to your voice, he said in announcing this synod, your sensitivities, your faith, even your doubts and your criticisms. One of the extraordinary things is he's not a Pope who runs away from conflict. He doesn't think we all have to think about everything in the same way. Once upon a time, we took pride in that in the Church, that there was one Catholic way to think about it. Well, that's a reasonably recent Catholic idea. If you go back to the New Testament, St. Paul and St. Peter had a pretty good stoush at the Council of Jerusalem, and that changed the Church. And they didn't agree on lots of things. There were lots of fights in the early Church, and they were good. I shouldn't say fights. There were lots of passionate disagreements, and we believe that's one of the way the Holy Spirit works. So Pope Francis has said to young people, don't hold back in telling us your criticisms. So what I want to do tonight is reflect on this question. Will our faith have young people, or are we going to age and die? I know our young people will have faith, but whether they find a home with us, that's a challenge. So that's not a mistake. It's will our faith have young people? And I came across this the other day and I liked it. A senility prayer. God, grant me the senility to forget the people I never liked anyway, the good fortune to run into the ones I do, and the eyesight to tell the difference. The other story about aging that I like is 3 men were discussing aging at their nursing home. And the 70-year-old said, oh, 70's the worst age to be. And the 80 and 90-year-old said, so what's wrong with 70? And he said, oh, your bladder doesn't work anymore. You go to the toilet and just nothing happens. The waterworks pack up. And the 80-year-old says, oh, no, 80's the worst age to be. He said, you go to the toilet and your bowel doesn't move anymore. It's just terrible. And the 90-year-old said, oh, that's nothing. 90 is the worst age to be. And the 70-year-old says, oh, does your bladder give you trouble? And he said, oh, no, my bladder works perfectly. It does its job at 6 o'clock every morning. Does your bowel give you trouble? No, it moves every morning at 6:30. They said, well, what's tough about being 90? And he said, I don't wake up till 10. So we do have to be aware that even look at this congregation, and we look at the synod, we're at least in parts of the world, in our parts of the world, your country and mine, we're aging. So we need to be very proactive about these questions. And I want to pick up a big international research project that the Vatican commissioned and the English-speaking bishops took up with great possession. They asked, in 2017, last year, they surveyed 30,000 young Catholics aged 16 to 29. That's the age group that the Synod is looking at. And they asked 2 questions. What are you looking for what are you most looking for within the Church? And what are the major blocks to belonging to the Church and participating in it? Well, there were an enormous number of responses that came back, but these were the big ones. So what are the top 4 things that young people were looking for within the Church? 89% said the first thing they wanted was a compassionate community, especially for the poor. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. They wanted us to be a merciful community. I can hear Pope Francis coming through here fairly strongly, that the Church can sometimes be presented as being a bit hard and harsh. And it'd be nice if our first instinct, as the Pope has called us to be, was to be compassionate, and especially for the poor, that our credibility is always best when we're serving the poor. The second is a more humble church that listens, especially to young adults' experience of the world. That's not unusual, that young people don't feel very listened to. But the humble church is also a big theme of Pope Francis, and it's amazing that that's started to come through now in what young people are saying about themselves, about our church. They wanted a more welcoming, inclusive, and joyful community. We want to come back to that. We're going to come back to all of these. And a community that practices what it preaches. And so they were the big ones that were over 80% of 30,000. That's a huge survey if you know anything about statistics. Over 80% came back and said they were the top 4 things that they were most looking for from us. Could it be said of St. Bede's that that describes the community? I think it could. In my experience of this community, I think you should be very proud indeed. But then, as the Pope said, your criticisms also are what I want to hear, what the church needs to hear. The 5 major blocks. The first was, no surprises, the sexual abuse of children by clergy and the hypocrisy of telling people how to live, and then some despicable and criminal people then obviously abusing children, just the most heinous of crimes. The second one was lifeless liturgies and poor preaching. Interestingly, the US young people, that wasn't as high for them, but it was in Australia and New Zealand, England and Canada, and in Ireland and Scotland. So I think your experience of liturgy and of music is much more superior. And you might have done some travel and gone to other masses in other parts of the world, and you know that you've got it pretty good at home. Why? Because you pay your musicians. That's part of the deal anyway. You pay musicians. You know, still in Australia, it would be some parishes pay musicians, but not everybody pays them. How do you know we are the only major Christian denomination who do not, as a rule, pay our musicians? The Episcopalians do, the Evangelicals most certainly do, the Lutherans do, the Presbyterians do, the Methodists do, the Orthodox these days do as well. How did we get into this situation? Because we had heroically and magnificently gifted nuns who slaved away in music lofts and they never got paid a cent. Not a penny. They did it all for God, and we got used to that. And we're still used to it. Thank God your parishes have moved. So lifeless liturgies and poor preaching. Lack of women's leadership. And I'd like to note that the young men said that as much as the young women did. The young women said it more, but only fractionally. That young men do find it odd that their sisters could not have rise up to be leaders in our community, but more on that soon. Negative attitudes towards sexuality, including celibacy. They don't get it. They don't understand why we're sort of seen to be fixated on issues to do with sexuality. We'll come back to that. And then finally, and this was a bit surprising for me, in a good way, how can a good and loving God allow suffering and pain in the world? So that's extraordinary. That's, again, an incredible list for the Synod and all of us to reflect on. How would we respond to it? Well, I want to lead the charge tonight by giving some form of response. Sexual abuse by church personnel. The sexual abuse crisis has seriously eroded the church's moral credibility. And even the Holy Father has said that. So this is not being nasty to the church or saying something that we shouldn't be saying in public, but not just for young people, for old people. I know relatives and friends of mine who have walked away from the practice of their faith over the issue of the sexual abuse of children and its cover-up. That bishops could have known this and then kept moving these people around where they abused again and again and again. And it's so seriously dysfunctional. And the Holy Father said, "There is no place in the church's ministry for those who commit these abuses. We need to do everything in our power to ensure that these sins have no place in the church. May God give us the grace to be ashamed." I've never thought of a grace, a gift of being ashamed, but I do now. Because some people still want to think these are all the enemies of the church who are bashing us up, that the press who are sort of delighting in all of these things. Well, some of that's true, but there are very, very serious matters here, and we have to be as honest and transparent as we can. When the Pope says there's no place for priests and brothers to remain in the active ministry, he's absolutely right, mainly because there isn't another professional group in the world where you can abuse a child sexually and remain. You can't stay a doctor, you can't stay a lawyer, you can't stay in the military, you can't stay in the diplomatic corps, you can't stay a teacher, a social worker, a psychologist, a psychotherapist. But somehow there are some people who think that as long as the priest is withdrawn, he can stay a priest. But the Pope and I both are in full agreement on this. I don't think we can. I don't think we should. I think what this does to victims is absolutely disheartening. It completely and utterly devastates them, that it's business as usual in a sense. I think we've got to make an important distinction. When we ask a priest who has abused a child, you have to leave the priesthood, and now the Vatican is actually removing them from the priesthood, whether they want to or not, then no one's saying that God won't be merciful. God's mercy is limitless. But what we are saying is that there is a limit on who can remain a leader in the church, retired or not. And here is the line in the sand. And when people say, oh, you're being a bit harsh, I'm not saying we don't care for people, because we have obligations to care for some of these people, but we also must be clear that to be a leader in the church, you can't have abused a child. There has to be a line in the sand somewhere. And I know this isn't easy, and I'm not going to dwell on this for long, and I spoke about it, I think, 2 years ago. I touched on this because it is a very big issue in the life of the church. But we really have now to be, when young people are saying the sheer hypocrisy of standing in a pulpit and saying one thing and then acting in such a different way, no wonder young people walk away. Who wants to belong to such a group of hypocrites? Well, we're not all, and the vast majority of clergy have never abused a child. The vast majority of clergy are good, faithful, holy men, and they're doing their best. And I'd have to say that has been very, very traumatic for those of us who are faithful and good priests to have to carry the burden of what some of our brothers have done. It would be a rare week in my life that as a relatively young priest, I'll be 25 years ordained this December, as a relatively young priest, it'd be a rare week of my life that somebody doesn't say, how could you be in the priesthood with all those pedophiles? That's quite a question to get most weeks of your life, isn't it? I don't know too many other professions, and I know it's a vocation, but I don't know too many other vocations where that question is indeed said that clearly and directly. Liturgy. They wanted a warm and generous community. Who feels welcome and included, and who doesn't feel welcome? Well, do you know where I discover people who don't feel welcome? They're at wedding receptions. Now, I'm the last priest in Australia who's going to wedding receptions. If you've been with me over these recent years here at St. Bede's, I know this will come as a shock to some of you, but many, many priests are shy. I know this will come as a shock. I'm not shy. I know that's incredible, but true. But a lot of priests, these days you don't get invited to wedding receptions. Like once upon a time, Catholic families always invited the clergy. They're expensive now and you don't get invited. So it's not always normal for the priest to be invited. But sometimes I'm invited and they've already put me down on the no, he's not coming list. And then I write back to 16 Bedford Avenue and say, I would be delighted to come to the wedding reception. And then it goes like this. Oh my God, the priest's coming. Where are we going to put the priest? Oh God, you've got to put the priest between two Mass-going Catholics, and we don't know any Mass-going Catholics. What are we going to do with the priest? So most Saturday nights, I'm on table 6 between Nana and Great Uncle Fred. And can I tell you, I have a very happy time there. If ever you get stuck on table 6 between Nana and Great Uncle Fred, simply ask one question. Where were you during the war? Let them decide which war they want to talk about. The Boer War, the First World War, Vietnam, Afghanistan. I don't care which war they want to talk about. Can I tell you, I have had some of the most wonderful conversations with these extraordinary people. Normally, older people have a story about the war. Just before I came away to the United States on this trip, I was at a wedding and I was sitting next to this beautiful, the grandmother of the bride, wonderful older lady, and I asked her, where were you during the war, and she said, do you know, I was engaged, and not to the bride's grandfather who died some years before, but she said, I was engaged in 1945 to a young soldier an Australian soldier, and he went off to fight with the Americans in the Pacific War, and he was arrested by the Japanese and put into a POW camp in Changi in Singapore, and he died there of malnutrition. And so she said, we never married, but I was engaged. And she said, and then I was lucky enough, blessed enough, that in 1947, I met the bride's grandfather and we married. And you know, she reflected on the man who died in 1945. She welled up with tears. She still loved that man. She'd still lost something very, very important. And that didn't take away for a moment from the love she had for the bride's grandfather, her husband, but it meant that she had this lovely moment. I said, I didn't mean to upset you. She said, they're the best tears in the world, because at least I've always known he's praying for me in heaven. That'll do me. Well, I go to wedding receptions. I can't tell you how many people come up and start the wedding reception by saying, Father, I used to go to Mass. I'd like $1 for every one time I get that one. I used to go to Mass, but... and then they go on to tell me why they've left the church or why they don't practice their faith. And normally it's something like around contraception, in vitro fertilization, abortion, male leadership in the church, homosexuality, sexual abuse of children. I'd like you to note the issues of gender and reproduction there. Why is it that no one has ever said to me, Father, I used to go to Mass, I used to be a Catholic, but I hate refugees, I'm domestically violent, I'm racist, I'm bigoted, and I won't share any of my money with the poor? No one has ever said that. Now, the church has got really strict teaching on that social side, but the only thing I hear people say they're hitting the road and won't come back is about gender and reproduction and sexuality. I think what messages are we giving out? And who feels excluded? So I think we do have to be very, very careful of being as welcoming and generous as we possibly can. The other reason I go to wedding receptions, by the way, is because I've discovered it's really good for business. You know, people will come up and say, Father, we weren't going to get married in the church, but you did a terrific job. How about doing our wedding? So I've just picked up another booking, and then it's good for gigs, I've discovered. And then they'll say, oh, you know, see the flower boy and the page girl, that's a bit gender interesting. See the page boy and the flower girl, we haven't had them baptized. I say, look, there's a fountain out the front of this reception venue. Let's go and jump in it now. And people will come up and say, see, Grandpa over there on table 7, Father, he's not looking too good. Have you got a card? We're planning his funeral on this side of the room. Which is a bit sad. The second thing we want to do at Liturgy is I'm not remotely interested in entertaining people, but I do want to engage them, because Jesus engaged people. He was an extraordinarily electric speaker and preacher. They came from everywhere to hear him. Do you know, in some dioceses, if you left out the Gloria or changed the words of the Creed, you would get a letter from the bishop on Wednesday. I hear you did this terrible thing on Sunday. I want to meet a bishop who wrote to a priest on Wednesday saying, I understand you really bored the congregation. Senseless. I don't know of that bishop. Now, I'm not seriously suggesting that bishops do that, but we do need to be engaging, because the Lord was. Now, that's vastly different to entertaining. I'm not remotely interested in entertaining people. But we have got sacred drama, sacred theatre. There's nothing wrong with that. And so we've got to do it as well as we possibly can. And then finally, I must admit, weddings, baptisms and funerals are the best opportunity for the church to reach out to a world on our terms. When do most unchurched people come to this church? For a wedding, a baptism or a funeral. And sometimes we're not all that welcoming. Sometimes we aren't as welcoming, I think US Catholicism is very welcoming, but we can and must even do better still, because it really matters. I'm writing a book right at the moment about sacraments, and it's got to be into my publisher by Easter time. And so I'm on the last chapter at the moment. So it's on A Catholic Guide to Sacraments, and I'm calling it Hatch, Match and Dispatch. I don't know if that'll survive as the title, but I like that title. So hatching, baptisms, matching, weddings, and dispatching at funerals. They're really, really important moments, because that's when the world comes to us on our terms. So when we talk about evangelization, I want to seriously talk about evangelization. in the most creative and good ways possible. Let's think then, moving on to women's leadership. Now, Pope Francis, of course, is extraordinary. I have to say that because he's a Jesuit and so am I. But I do think he's extraordinary, and he's been great on this question, I'd have to say. He said about last year, I think it was, women must have a greater presence in all the decision-making areas of the church. They cannot be limited to the fact of being an altar server or the catechist. No, we need to create still broader opportunities for a more inclusive female presence in the church. And this presents a church with profound and challenging questions which cannot be lightly evaded. So, taking the Holy Father and these young people whom he says, I want to hear your criticisms, then I think we've got to make a few points. First is there's a very important distinction between ordination and leadership. There are some men who are ordained, but they're not particularly great leaders. Leadership is given by the people. People follow somebody. And some of the greatest leaders we've got in the church aren't necessarily our clergy, they're actually some extraordinary women. For instance, most of the leaders and workers in Catholic education, healthcare, welfare, retreat houses, chaplaincies, pastoral care, CCD and parishes are women, as well as the first formers of the faith in the home. And if you didn't know that was true, then I'd like to challenge all the women in this parish to do one thing. I want every woman in the Catholic Church next week to go on strike, just to remind the men who's running the church. Because women are running the church, and they always have. Your own leadership in this parish, as significant as the men may be, would absolutely fall over if it wasn't for the extraordinary women who are here. The Pope, as you know, or may know, I hope you have heard, has opened up the question of whether we reordain women as deacons. And the reason they're reordained is that, in fact, they're in the New Testament. We have Phoebe, Prisca and Euodia, who are named as deacons of the church by St. Paul, and then they were suppressed in the 4th century for a whole variety of complex reasons we won't go into tonight. So the Pope has asked the International Theological Commission to look again at the question of whether we should and can have women deacons or women readmitted to the order of deacons. Personally, I would welcome it tomorrow, because I have seen women in situations of ministry where they may not be ordained into the diaconate, but honestly, they're just the face of Christ. They're the hands of Christ, the voice of Christ. And I'd love our community to recognise that in a very formal way as well. Also, I think that women should be welcomed into the College of Cardinals. Firstly, because most women look smashing in red. But secondly, because most Catholics don't know this, but the College of Cardinals had lay men in it as well as clerics for most of its history. I'd hate you to think I'm pulling the wool over your eyes or saying something trendy here. We had lay men until 1899. The last lay man cardinal was Teodolfo Cardinal Mertel. He was the Secretary of State to Pius IX. He was an Italian count. And it was only in 1917 that the Code of Canon Law said that they had to be priests, and then John the 23rd in 1960 said they had to be bishops. Though right at the moment, I think we've got about 17 who have got an exemption from being bishops. They requested that of the Pope, and the Pope allowed that. So they don't have to be bishops. They are all priests at the moment. But seeing the code of, we've had, from 1056, we've had these extraordinary, the College of Cardinals. Then I want to go back to the old tradition now of having laymen and now lay women. Now, the laity can't be elected the Bishop of Rome, obviously, but they would be there doing the voting, and I think that would be a wonderful, wonderful thing for the entire church. Again, this is not terribly trendy. We've had at least 4 or 5 cardinals in recent years who have suggested this. There's not any evidence the Pope is prepared to move on this question just yet, but when is it going to happen? When I become the Pope. That's what's going to happen. Let's talk about sexuality, because we must. The church regularly gets caught in being defined by what we're against. And I think we should be out there much more positively. It's tended always to be what we don't like. And many of us who went through Catholic education or came through devout Catholic homes, some of us got some very negative images about sexuality. In actual fact, St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that sexuality is a gift given by God that we might flourish in the world. That's an extraordinary thing. No one told the brothers who taught me that. I was not told that. So it's a gift given by God to enable me to flourish. But as with every gift, yes, we have the responsibility of using it and carrying it well. So it's not a free-for-all and do what you like and everything's okay. No, but that's not true of any gift we get. Money is another one that comes to mind. Being rich or poor is value neutral in the Christian life. It's what you do with it that tells me who you are. Because the absolute cornerstone of the Church's teaching on sexuality is dignity. And St. John Paul II, without question, gave one of the great contributions to the world in 1979 in his very first encyclical called Redemptor Hominis, the Redeemer of Humanity. And he said, you can talk about human rights all you like, but unless we're talking about human dignity, we haven't got very far. And he put back on the world's lips the concept of dignity. It's an extraordinary thing. We were very big on human rights. And Pope John Paul II came back and said, really, we have to talk about human dignity. And the cornerstone of our teaching isn't what we're against, it's what we're for. We're absolutely for people's dignity, everywhere. For the protection of children, defending the rights of parents and families as well, for what their children are exposed to. All of these things, it's part of the package of dignity that we want to go out to the world with. That's why we're against prostitution and pornography, and we're against adultery and abusive forms of sexuality, because we think it isn't particularly helpful in helping people's dignity. It strips away people from the dignity that is given to them by being a son and daughter of God. Sexuality can now be just a desire, just devoid of any choice, responsibility in relation, just another entertainment option. So our young people are getting very, very, very mixed messages. I think it's a really tough time to be a 15-year-old. I don't think this is easy at all. The number of voices that you're hearing all the time, often saying very conflicting things. And then who do you listen to? Who's to be trusted? This is tough, but we've got to get back there. Now, the young people directly mention celibacy. There's no question that celibacy can change. And it is, in fact, already changing, because it's a discipline, not a doctrine. If you think I'm making any of this up, well, Jesus and Paul, Titus and Timothy were certainly celibate, but he never mandated it for all of his disciples. And we know that, for instance, Peter was married. It really starts growing from only the late 4th century in the Western Roman Church. And then it's only finally in 1074 when Pope Gregory VII came along and finally it was mandated. They had a few goes at trying to do it before that, but it wasn't very successful. So it's in 1074 we get the final law that comes down and says that you have to be a celibate to be a Catholic priest. Well, things have changed because we've got Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and some Presbyterians who are Methodists, Episcopalians, who have come over into the church, and they're married with children. Well, we haven't killed their wives and children, thank God. We have welcomed their wives and children, and they've been ordained Catholic priests. And this gets really tense. Do you know in the Diocese of Westminster in London, they've now got some 62 former Anglican priests who are married. 62, that's a lot. And then we'll say to a young man who's born a Roman Catholic, well, you can't get married, but he's going to be in a parish and maybe working for a pastor who has got his own church and his own family. So we're already setting up a fairly major issue there, I think. If you think, well, what a really smart boy would do who wants to be married with children and then come and become a priest, will go off and become an Anglican first and then convert later to Catholicism. If you do that, you can't get ordained. The church has already closed that loophole. Mind you, I always think of my brother when I think of my own commitment to celibacy, because when I was ordained a Catholic priest, I went back to my parish and said Mass for the family, for the parish. And Mrs. Sullivan, Mary Sullivan, was our leading parishioner. And I was talking to my brother and sister-in-law and their children outside the church after this Mass, after I was newly ordained. And I went up, Mary came up and she said, "Oh, Father, to think that in this day and age you would give your life to Christ as a celibate priest and with poverty and obedience as a Jesuit. This is marvellous. And to think our parish is so blessed to have been able to have a part in this vocation. And then she turned to my brother Peter and she said, Peter, to think your family in this day and age has produced a Jesuit priest who's poor, chaste and obedient for Christ. To which my brother looked up and he said, Mrs. Sullivan, I am married, I own 3 businesses and I have 4 children. I am more poor, more celibate and more obedient than he'll ever be. So what I'm suggesting is that these are questions which until recently we haven't discussed, but in fact we can discuss them, and we're not being disloyal, we're not being inappropriate, and indeed the Pope has tried to encourage us to have a charitable and good discussion about these issues, hoping the Holy Spirit is helping us discern what is the best next move, if there need to be a move at all. The image of God the young people came up with. And I love the line out of Marcus Borg, which I think I gave you last time, in a wonderful book that's worth reading, The God We Never Knew. Tell me your image of God and I'll tell you your theology. Tell me your image of God and I'll tell you your theology. Do you know, some people, and maybe some people in this church, have had pretty negative images of God. It's not our fault. We were given them by the church, by people in the church, and we have to take responsibility for that. But I'll give you an example. I may have told this a couple of years ago, but I can't remember if I did. But my Auntie Margaret was, in 1955, was a surgical nurse. And she tells the story that on a Tuesday night while she was working at a big public Catholic hospital in Sydney called St Vincent's, run by the Irish Sisters of Charity, and it's mainly for the poor, St Vincent's Hospital, and they had case after case after case. She ran from theatre to theatre to theatre with the surgeons, fixing up car accidents and other major issues. So much so that she had a 12-hour shift from 7 to 7, and she got off work at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday morning in 1955 and went home to her apartment and cooked herself up a big plate of bacon and eggs because she was absolutely starving. She hadn't eaten anything for 12 hours. She thought her flatmate must have been sleeping in, but then she heard the door open and in walked her flatmate, who was also a Catholic, of course, and she was sporting a big black ash on her forehead. Oh my God. It was Ash Wednesday and Auntie Margaret has just finished the bacon and eggs. Margaret is no religious nut or no zealot, she's not crazy. She was a very normal Catholic for 1955. She said, I jumped up, raced off to the bathroom to try and make myself throw up. That was option 1. When that wasn't successful, she got on a bus to go to what was then the first place in Sydney, and still is the first place in Sydney you can go to confession. Now imagine rather than get on the bus, she was run over by the bus. This is what we thought would happen next. That if she met a terrible accident and went to her maker at that moment, if that had happened, she gets to God and God says, Margaret, you've been a wonderful person. You have looked after the poor, you've been a great nurse, you've been an extraordinary woman, you've gone to Mass on Sunday, you've said the rosary, you've said your prayers, you've been a wonderful girl. But what are we going to do about the bacon, honey? I'm sorry, the bacon's a deal breaker. Hell for eternity for you. Now, even in 1955, officially, she was not in a state of serious mortal sin because it had to be serious matter. We thought that was in those days. Secondly, you had to have full knowledge and full intention and full freedom. Well, a good number of those weren't present. But she thought she was going to go to hell. Tell me your image of God, and I'll tell you your theology. And as you know, in Where the Hell is God, and I revisit some of those issues here in What Does It All Mean? There is a big difference between God permitting evil in the world and God sending evil to the world. We've been very bad on that distinction. But God can't send you breast cancer. God can't kill our children. God can't set up car accidents because they're destructive things. And God doesn't deal in destruction. God doesn't deal in evil. So we've never been good on this, although officially it is what we believe. God permits evil in the world for the sake of our freedom, but it's a vastly different thing to saying that God is sending evil. God doesn't send evil. God cannot send evil. Why? Because God is light. In him there is no darkness. And We have to see Jesus in action is to see God in action. So if Jesus wasn't into destroying people, sending plagues, sending locusts, putting floods over the earth and turning people into pillars of salt, then nor is God, because Jesus is the final face of God for the world. That's what we believe. It's not trendy. To have seen me is to have seen the Father. I do nothing on my own. The Father and I are one. So we don't have nasty God in heaven, lovely Jesus, and the bird. You know, that's people's sort of image of the Trinity. And we've got the Father, the Son, and the Spirit who save together, create together, and redeem together. They're the one and the same God, revealed completely in Jesus Christ the Lord. So yes, I have let go of some parts of the Old Testament for one reason only. I can't reconcile it with Jesus, because that's nasty and vengeful and murderous, and Jesus wasn't into any of that. And to have seen me is to have seen the Father. Those young people, first thing they wanted was a compassionate community, especially towards the poor. Do you know, I've done a lot of research. I did some research for you last time I was here 2 years ago, but I've done even more, because we don't even tell one another and our young people the good we do every day. For instance, I discovered this, that the Catholic Church in the United States runs 1,389 aged care centres caring for 640,000 people. And most of those would not be rich. They would be really struggling. Our commitment there is great. And also, Catholic Charities, a network of 177 Catholic agencies, 3,449 centres that assisted last year 25.2 million people. And it also runs 1,380 food banks, which last year looked after 6.6 million people. That's extraordinary. We are feeding the poor. We also have 60,000 people who receive disaster relief from Catholic Charities, and 325,000 illegal immigrants, and 70,000 refugees receive social services and healthcare from one of the Catholic Charities last year. They looked after another 8.5 million undocumented clients at 2,600 local sites across the country. Now, these are big issues for your country and mine, and people get a bit hysterical about immigration, and I understand that there are serious issues, and I'm not here to talk about your reality. Every time someone comes to our country and tells us what we're like and what we should do, every Australian says, "There's the airport, goodbye." So I'm not going to commit that crime here. But I think it is fantastic that we're right on the cutting edge with people who are desperately poor. The St. Vincent de Paul is, in fact, the largest charitable volunteers agency in the United States, I've discovered. 160,000 people belong to the Vincent de Paul, and they gave 11.6 million hours last year, and they assisted 14 million people. That's amazing. Imagine if we stopped doing it. And then finally, through your incredible generosity, your Catholic Relief that sends money overseas raised $651 million last year and reached 85 million people in 101 countries. Now that's little boxes of coins that we might send in. Every little bit helps. Now the reason I raise that is not look at us, aren't we great, aren't we wonderful? It's not that at all. This is what Christ is doing for us in touching the poor, in going out to the world. Some of our young people may not know that. They may not know that every day we're committed to looking after the poor in the way that we are. And I think we better tell them. The second thing they said is they wanted a more humble church. Do you know the word humble comes from the Hebrew word humus, from which we get a certain dip, by the way. It's the same root word. And actually, it doesn't mean to put yourself down. It means to be grounded. The word humus in Hebrew means to be grounded. And Pope Francis has said it better than anyone. The world tells us to seek success, power, and money. God tells us to seek humility, service, and love. I think they're the three elements of what actually would be attractive to people. Humility, service, and love. And we've been brought to humility through the sexual abuse cases, but even more so, we've got to be grounded people. Also being joyful, an inclusive church. Do you know, one of the texts I love most is John chapter 20, where Thomas is the so-called Doubting Thomas. We shouldn't call him Doubting Thomas, by the way, because he goes on to say one of the greatest things said about Jesus in the entire New Testament, my Lord and my God. I like Thomas. I like him that he was he was full of doubts and questions, so I like that. And he normally gives a lot of us a lot of hope, because some of us have got questions and issues over the time. But I really like the story. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time and isn't there to encounter the risen Lord. Comes back and says, I don't believe you. Until I can put my hand in the side, I will not believe. And then we're told a week later, he's among them. Jesus appears and says, happy are those who have not seen but believe. That's all of us. So we've got to be as generous and engaging. I want to just focus for one moment on that week. Do you know there is no evidence, clearly they didn't kick Thomas out. What did the early church do? They held on to him in his questions and his doubts. When people have questions and doubts, that doesn't worry me, but I hope they're sincerely looking for answers to their question. We know some people who simply want to have a whole lot of questions because they want to walk out. Okay, they're not sincerely looking for answers. But I know people who are young people who are genuinely searching and wanting to get answers. I want to support them in that. Some Catholics, unless you can walk the walk and talk the talk, well, there's the door. Don't let it hit you on the way out. They're a bit too quick to move everybody off. And the early church was not like this. He was with them, and then he was there, able to have his own encounter. And if we're truly in love with Christ, Pope Francis says, and we sense how much he loves us, our hearts will light up with a joy that spreads to everyone around us. And as you know, his first letter to the church was all about joy, the gospel of joy. If you're a happy Catholic, can you please tell your face about it sometime soon? Some Catholics are doing an awful lot of laughing on the inside, but they're very serious because they've made a fundamental error. I don't save the world, thank God. Christ saves the world, and I help out. But some people, they carry the salvation of the world as though it all depends on them. It doesn't. We have to do our best, but in actual fact, it's Christ's behaviour. So we've got to get our words right, and may they be as joyful, inclusive, and generous as they can be. Mind you, I love the story of the time the young priest was having trouble with his sermons. So he asked the local bishop for help. Well, said the bishop, try something to get the congregation's attention right off the bat. Get into the pulpit and start out. Last night, I was in the warm embrace of a good woman. He said, I always find that sparks the congregation's attention. And then go on to reveal how warm and accepting she was. And at the end, tell them all, it was your mother. Beautiful for sermons about family love. The following Sunday, the young priest decided to take the bishop's advice immediately. But when he got into the pulpit, something got lost in translation. Last night, I was in warm embrace. I was in the warm embrace of a hot woman. The congregation audibly gasped. He realised he'd forgotten the rest of the story, so he said, I don't remember who she was, but the bishop really recommended her. So we've got to get the words right. Words matter because they put structure, they put meaning around our experience of the world. Those young people said that we have to practice what we preach. Well, I gave this to you 2 years ago, but I've updated it for you. Do you know that the US Catholic Church has 5,360 elementary, middle schools, 1,200 high schools, and 248 schools for the disabled? The church educated last year 1.94 million students that saved the US taxpayer $22 billion. Because if all of those kids came into the government sector, the public sector, that's what the price would be. And our Catholic community, through scholarships, through fee paying, is doing an extraordinary contribution in education. There are 3.1 million public school students receiving religious education through the parish CCD program. Extraordinary, wonderful people who are involved there, and I know you've got a great one in this parish. There are 645 Catholic hospitals in the United States, and last year they cared for 88 million people. That's an extraordinary contribution. That's a tough one for us at the moment because healthcare in all our countries is getting more and more and more expensive. So we're getting squeezed out of healthcare in the way that we were, but we're holding in there as best we can. Catholic hospitals employ 774,000 people, and there are 105 Catholic residential homes for children looking after 18,000 kids. When we go over to the church itself, there are 196 dioceses, 17,000 parishes, 45 sisters, 14,000 brothers, this is just in the United States, 37,000 priests, 19,000 deacons, 40,000 lay ministers, serving 71 million Catholics and serving many other people be well beyond our Catholic community. You also, of the English-speaking world, have the highest rates of practice. The last figure I could find on the bishop's website, 29.6% of all Catholics in the United States worship regularly. That's once a month or more, not necessarily every week, but once a month or more. That's 21 million Catholics. That's a lot of people. And that's actually the combined population of all of those cities. If you put all of those cities together, that's who turns up to Mass once a month or more in the Catholic Church. More than the population of New York easily go to Mass every Sunday. That's phenomenal. So now we'd like it to be better and more, don't get me wrong, but sometimes we can get so discouraged that we can never look at anything that's good, and we think it's all finished and we're over and it's done. That's not true. And you should, in fact, be very proud and indeed encouraging. As Monsignor said, let's bring a friend tomorrow night. Well, let's take a friend back to Mass too. The last part of the Synod's work is going to be on vocation discernment, and it's a very broad understanding of vocation. The definition they're working on is the love which takes concrete form in everyday life through a series of choices which finds expression in the states of life: married, ordained ministry, consecrated life, professions, forms of social and civil commitment, lifestyle, the management of time and money. So it's very broad, and it's trying to say that we all have a vocation. The word vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, meaning to be called. And so in all of these ways, we're called to live out our faith, hope and love. And sometimes vocations only ever meant being in the priesthood or the religious life. Well, thank God, it's now the common vocation of our baptismal call. Do you know, I want to tell you a story. When in 1941, when my uncle, who was a priest, went off to the seminary, he was on a ranch. My father's family were all ranchers. And the local people, even though, you know, Episcopalians and Methodists and Lutherans and Presbyterians and Catholics, in Australia anyway, we didn't get on very well, and we could be pretty nasty to each other. The local community of those ranchers was so proud that a young man was going off to become a priest in 1941 that they had a big reception for him in the local hall, and they'd raised money, and in the middle of World War II, they raised enough money to give him a set of luggage to send him off to start studying for the Catholic priesthood. Fast forward to 1981, and I'm going off to become a Jesuit, and I'm studying at the university at that time. My friends also, unbeknownst to me, took up a collection, and they took me out to dinner 2 nights before I left Brisbane to go to Sydney to enter the Jesuits. And I'll never forget that the card when I got home inside had a cheque for $1,000. Now that's a lot of money for young people to find, $1,000, but the card was very interesting. It said, you're to do one of 2 things with this money before you enter the Jesuits on Sunday. You are to go to a psychiatrist or visit a brothel. I'm not telling you how I spent the money. But look at the change in 40 years. The district would take up money for a set of luggage, so proud that a young man was off to the ministry. And my contemporaries thought I was mad or needed some sexual help. Now that's a shift. That's a major shift. So when we come to talk about vocations to the priesthood and religious life, the issue of sexuality is right underneath that, and we have to be very clear on that, because again, young people are getting so many conflicting reports and thinking about sexuality these days. And we must pray that whether we're married, single, priest or religious, that we boldly witness to the gospel in every way we can. And those of us who are nuns, brothers and priests, you know, we could start telling our face that we're happy to be a nun, brother and priest. You know, if I have a challenge to Catholics about smiling, I think a few nuns, brothers and priests could smile a bit more, you know, because who'd want to join that really, you know, that rather unhappy bunch? You know, I have been with religious women especially who are just so happy. They're so extraordinary and they're so good. I have equally been with some whom, honestly, they might be very holy, and that's true of brothers and priests as well, very holy in their vocation, but it doesn't look like it's giving them a lot of life, a lot of energy, a lot of attraction for other young people as well. I was, for a period of time, the vocations director for the Jesuits in Australia, and I'll never forget that a friend of mine who runs an ad agency, he offered to help us with new advertisements for the Jesuits in Australia, and I was given 2 hours to work with his creative team. Oh my goodness, I wasn't in Kansas anymore, Dorothy, I can tell you. There were 10 young people, all dressed in black, head to foot, and they're all chain smoking, even though there were signs on the wall, don't smoke. Apparently the creative people need to smoke a lot. This is sort of like Mad Men, if you ever watched that series. It was very similar. Anyway, they bounced around a few ideas, and then eventually the leader of the group, called Scott turned to me and he said, "Listen, Father, just tell us in a sentence, what's the product we're pushing?" And I said, okay, I guess I want young men between the ages of 18 to 35 who want to be poor, chaste and obedient for Christ for life. And he took a big drag on his cigarette and he said, "Well, that's the hardest product I've ever had to sell in my life." Because the context has changed so dramatically these days. But I do want to challenge you. You know, people come along to me and say, "Oh, Father, what are you doing about vocations?" "Well, I'm trying to live a happy Jesuit life. That's what I'm doing. What are you doing?" I hope you're living your vocation happily, but I want to challenge you a bit more. Have you ever said to anyone, "I could see you being a very happy religious"? Have you ever thought you might have a vocation? You know, lots of Catholics groan and moan about no priests and no nuns and no brothers, but they don't want their grandkids to go and become a nun or brother. They never suggested it to their own children, and somehow it's got to be somebody else's kids and grandkids who go off and do it. Well, I think we've all got to take responsibility for this in the life of the church. And of course, the other thing we have to just own is Catholics are now having the same number of children as the population. In the United States, it's 1.9 children. I haven't got a clue what a 0.9 baby looks like, but that's what the women of the United States are having. Well, if you have 1.9 children and then you become celibate, that doesn't equal grandchildren. So one of the things behind this is even smaller Catholic families. And then the final text that the Pope has given the Synod to reflect on is Luke, where Luke chapter 2, actually, I think. Or Luke 1, no, it's the Annunciation right at the end of that first chapter. I want to say a couple of things about the Annunciation. Mary don't make Mary too old. Mary was between the ages, the betrothal age in first century Palestine was 12 to 14. So split the difference, she was the 13-year-old girl. Don't make St. Joseph too old. 17 to 19 was the normal age. There's nothing in the text that said they weren't the normal ages, nothing at all. So he was 18. Now I love St. Joseph. His feast day's coming up. I love St. Joseph. What an extraordinary man. We won't celebrate him, unfortunately, because Sunday will take precedence, but it's this Sunday, the 18th. St. Joseph is an extraordinary man. Do you know that he is not recorded as uttering a single word in the New Testament? Not a word. He is the great backroom player. He doesn't say a word. And do you know how he comes to know what God might require of him? In his dreams. In his dreams. I love that. That God works through our imagination and even through our dreams. That's how Joseph comes to discern what the Lord requires, and he never utters a word. For those of you who are shy, there's your patron saint. I'm not, he's not my patron saint. So, because my mother says I've never had an unspoken thought in my life. And that's probably true. Have you noticed that Joseph, who was probably 18 years of age, they normally make him 96 not out? Have you noticed that? Holy pictures and statues often make St. Joseph. He's not too bad there, but he's often looking very old. And the reason they did that is because he dies, well, the last time we hear about him is when Jesus is 12, so we assume he died soon after. The other thing is they certainly have to make sure that he has no interest in the Blessed Virgin Mary. So they thought by making him a very old man, then he wouldn't be very sexually interested. I don't know that they've met some of the old men I've met. I don't think that quite gets you off the hook just quietly. So I think that This is a brilliant text to think about. Mary and Joseph were very young, but we're never coerced into our vocation. We respond to it. Grace doesn't coerce us, doesn't force us. We're responding to it. We're always free to say yes. Now, I don't seriously believe this, but the other day I had a thought, which I might put in a book that's coming up. How do we know whether Mary may have been the 7th person that the angel Gabriel went to? And the other 6 said no. Oh no, I'm not doing that. No, goodbye. And on the 7th, Our Lady says yes. Now, I don't seriously believe that, but it does reveal free will. We have to be passionate about free will because that's one of the great gifts that God has given creation. We are free people to respond. So how do we respond in faith, hope and love? By being the best people and modelling it for our young people. When people say to me, Father, my grandkids, my kids, they don't go to Mass, what am I going to do? I say, be the most transparently faithful, hopeful and joyful Catholic you can possibly be. Because I'm telling you right now that you've stomped your foot and told them they're going to hell and that they're committing a mortal sin. You've been doing that for 20 years and that hasn't been working. So let's stop doing things that don't work and try a new strategy of being transparently joyful and of great energy with our faith. All I know is at some funerals, people will come along and say, I don't know what Nana and Pop had, Father, but their faith gave them an awful lot of comfort and a lot of joy. Bingo. That's a conversation I can now have. Our witness to our faith is how our young people will find a home among us. But there's not one way of being a Catholic, and I want to finish the entire night by telling you a story about different ways, a different way of being Catholic. When I was accepted into the Jesuit novitiate, I thought that I may never get to go overseas again. Boy, was I wrong. But anyway, I thought I might never travel again, so I thought I'm going to go and become a backpacker around Europe. Now, every single drop of me is Irish. And so my uncle, one of the priests, he had found all the Irish relatives in the 50s, so I wrote ahead of time, and when I got there, when I got to Dublin, I rang Mary Lynch, who was the matriarch of the Ryan clan, and she was probably our closest relatives in Ireland. And 2 days later, I alighted at Charleville train station, and there was Mary to meet me off the station, off the train at the station. She took one look at me and burst into tears. It was a bit off-putting, and then I said, Mary, why are you crying? She said, oh, you're the youngest Jesuit priest I have ever seen in my life. Now, I explained to Mary that I wasn't a Jesuit and I wasn't a priest. I was going home to become a Jesuit and well down the track one day to be ordained a Catholic priest, I hoped. Anyway, she nodded knowingly. As we drove away from the train station, she said, Richard, do you mind if we go to Kathleen McMahon's wake on the way home? Well, I'd never been to an Irish wake, and I thought that'll be an interesting experience. Well, never a truer word had been said, because I said, oh, that'd be great. So we went into Kathleen's fairly simple house, 2 rooms upstairs, 2 rooms downstairs. We went in the door and immediately turned right into Kathleen's lounge room. And there was the coffin with the lid up, and Kathleen was propped up in the coffin, and there were 3 or 4 ladies who were saying the rosary. And I had never seen anything. We don't have this tradition in Australia at all, mainly because historically, of course, the weather was so hot, you had to bury fairly quickly. So Mary didn't miss a beat. She looked at Kathleen. She said, well, look at you, Kathleen McMahon. If you are not the most beautiful corpse I have ever seen. And then she turned to the ladies and she said, and let's face it, ladies, in life, Kathleen wasn't much to look at, but in death, darling, you've come up trumps. She said, but I'm forgetting myself. She said, Kathleen, ladies, this is me cousin, Father Richard Leonard, a Jesuit priest from Australia. Now, everything in that sentence was pretty well a lie. I was not a Jesuit, I was not a priest, cousin was generous, but I was Richard Leonard, that's true. But I didn't know what to do. Do you shake a corpse's hand? Do you bow in their direction? I didn't know what the protocol was. But then Kathleen said, oh no, Father, but you might, one of the ladies said, Father, you might lead us in the decade of the Rosary. And I don't know why, but she said, we're up to the sorrowful mysteries. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I can't remember any of them right at the moment. Maybe it was that I'd just been introduced to a corpse, but the only ones I could remember were the joyful ones. So I said, oh, let's say the joyful ones, because, Mary's gone to be with God in heaven. I had to make something up. And she said, oh no, Father O'Reilly will not let us see the joyfuls at the wake. We can only see the glorious and the sorrowful. Now, telling lies was catching in that room, because I said, to save my own embarrassment that I couldn't remember the others, I said, oh look, that was true in Australia until the Second Vatican Council, when they all came back and told us that we could say the joyful mysteries. And with that, one of the ladies said, you wait till I see Father O'Reilly tomorrow. To think we could have been doing the joyfuls all these years. She said, you'll go straight ahead, Father, and that's exactly what I did. After that was over, they then said, oh, would you like to see the men? And I wondered where they were, and then out in the backyard were these wonderful old Irish men's faces all around a drum fire, and they were all drinking Irish whiskey. And Mary said, this is my cousin, Father Richard Leonard, a Jesuit priest from Australia, and he'll have a Paddy's whiskey when you're ready. Well, that was certainly true, I can assure you. So I got a very big tumbler of whiskey, I'd have to say. And then all of a sudden, Mary was back about maybe 15, 20 minutes later and said, come in now, gentlemen, because Father is going to bless the corpse. And I just assumed that Father O'Reilly had arrived. So we all crammed into the lounge room. And then I realized I was the priest that was supposed to be blessing the corpse. Well, I'm not supposed to be. I can only bless myself at this stage. So this is just crazy. But I put my hands out and I sang the Irish blessing. Until we meet again, may God hold you in the hollow of his hand. And with that, one of the elderly men looked up and said to Mary, oh, Mary, and to think your cousin came all the way around the world to sing at our Kathleen's wake our beautiful blessing. I tell you what, those Leonards were quality people, and they should never have been sent into that God-forsaken country as convicts. We did go as convicts, and this was all said as though it had just happened last week. It was amazing. And as we were taking leave, one of the ladies, I overheard her say to one of the others, and to think that Kathleen McMahon didn't even go to daily mass. She only went to Sunday mass, and she got a Jesuit priest to sing the Irish blessing at her wake. And I thought two things. One is, a witch will be a witch in any country in the world. And secondly, I wanted to yell back and say, she didn't get any of that. She got a fraud. That's what she got. When we got home to Mary's farm, I met all of the family and the cousins, and we had a great night. And then that night at dinner, at the end of dinner, she jumped up and she said, oh, now, Father, it's time to go on visitation. And in some parts of rural Ireland, even now, people start visiting each other's homes at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. So in every single farm we went into, every single house, she said, oh, this is my cousin, Father Richard Leonard, a Jesuit priest from Australia. But now there was a new thing to add. And he likes the Paddy's whiskey, and he'll have a big one when you're ready. So now I was an alcoholic as well. Well, I got home at 2:30 a.m, flopped into bed, knowing that in rural Ireland the late-to-bed tradition was very intelligently covered by a late-to-rise tradition as well, except at 6 a.m, Mary was knocking on the door. You wake, Father. Father O'Reilly is expecting us at Holy Mass. Oh, my goodness. And so I got up and I got dressed, and I realised I was not hungover. I was still drunk, I think. But I got in the car and into the Sacred Heart Kilmallock County Limerick Church we went, and waiting in the vestibule of that wonderful, magnificent bluestone church was Father O'Reilly. And he said, oh, Father Leonard, he said, would you like to celebrate the Holy Mass? Now, things were really getting out of control. Impersonating a priest at a sacrament is, well, it's behind adultery, it's behind murder, but it's above adultery. It's very serious. So I had to make something up, because Mary had obviously told him I was a priest. And I said, oh, look, I'm a Jesuit, and we have to say our Mass later in the day for the intentions of the Pope. It sounded good. And he said, oh, look, I remember that from the seminary now. Yeah, they told me that, the Jesuits always do a Mass for the intention of the Pope. I thought, oh, I don't care, but this is getting out of control. So he said, we'd like to welcome Father Leonard to the Holy Mass this morning. Father isn't celebrating because he's got to do his own thing later in the day for the intentions of the Pope. But he might read the first reading. So with that, I got a big dig in the ribs from Mary, and up the aisle I went. When I got to the lectern, I realised I wasn't as secure on my pins as I thought I was, but the Holy Spirit really had a wonderful sense of humour. I looked down. Do you know what the reading, where it was from? The prophet Habakkuk. Try saying that when you're sober. Like, I haven't got a clue what that reading was about. After, in the vestibule of the church, when Mass was over, up came these beautiful local ladies and knelt down and asked for a first priestly blessing, because you are without question the youngest Jesuit priest we've ever seen in our lives. Well, I thought, oh, this can't hurt, but so I kept doing this and doing that, and I thought, oh, this is dreadful. And then I said to Mary after breakfast, I feigned a call back to Dublin, and I got out of there, because I thought she's going to have me be made the bishop by lunchtime if I hang around here. It was unbelievable. So, incredibly, when I went back to study in England in 1996, I knew that Mary Lynch was dying, and I was going to get over there fairly quickly. I arrived on the 1st of January. Mary died on the 8th of January. But she had told her children that because I was coming to England, she would love it if I would come and say her Requiem Mass. So they flew me over after she died, and I walked out into Sacred Heart Church, Kilmallock in County Limerick, and at Mary's Requiem Mass, I said, I am Father Richard Leonard, a Jesuit priest from Australia, and for the first time I was telling the truth. Now, if we want our young people to be part of our community, there's not one way of being Catholic. There's an Italian way and an Irish way and an Australian way and an American way. There's a Mexican way and an El Salvadorian way, because God has given his community into culture. And one of the things I hope we do best is we're able to witness to what is best in each of our cultures, and then link it to the great culture of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Wouldn't it be wonderful to think that we had some great Catholic friends in our community who loved us so much that even to get to our wake and say, you are the most beautiful corpse I have ever seen, even if it wasn't true. All I know is that our faith will have young people if we keep witnessing to the faith that gives us life. This synod really matters. This conversation really matters. So let's finish tonight with a blessing. Do not be afraid, I am with you. I have called you by your name, you are mine. I have called you by your name, you are mine. Do not be afraid, I am with you. I have called you by your name, you are mine. I have called you by your name, you are mine. I have called you by your name, you are mine. And may our faith always have the young people we seek and deserve. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thanks very much.